The blue LED monitor light flickered against the soundproof foam panels on my office wall, casting a pale, sickly haze across my desk. On the main terminal screen, a gray administrative UI banner hummed with a live digital progress bar. Equity transfer pending, 1:59:42 remaining. Exactly 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 42 seconds until 80% of Vance Logistics, the freight carrier my late father built with his bare hands, was legally absorbed into a shell entity. I sat in the dark, my eyes burning behind a pair of cheap 3-week-old disposable contact lenses that were micro-tearing my left cornea every time I blinked. But my hand on the mouse didn't tremble. Not anymore. Because deep inside our shared cloud drive, buried under 3 layers of archived supply chain manifests, I had already locked down a single 4-digit merchant code. A tiny 4-digit clerical classification that was about to turn my sister-in-law's multi-million-dollar corporate absorption into a catastrophic fraud audit before that digital clock ever hit 0. Look, let's just say, when you're sitting in a windowless back room at 3 in the afternoon watching a digital progress bar count down the exact seconds until your own family legally strips away 10 years of your sweat, something fundamental inside you just stops. When you sit alone in that dark space and realize the people who share your last name view you as nothing more than an operational liability to be liquidated, how long do you sit there before you realize logic is the only weapon you have left? I mean, make no mistake, I didn't get to this desk by choice. For 10 straight years, I've been the inventory operations auditor for Vance Logistics. 60 hours a week, 6 days a week. Sitting in this windowless 12-by-12 back office right behind the main loading bay, smelling the diesel exhaust seep through the floorboards every time a semi-truck idling outside hit the air brakes. My official salary on the payroll ledger was $31,000 a year, barely above minimum wage. I took that pay cut voluntarily 6 years ago when the regional freight market dipped, believing my brother when he swore every dollar saved was a dollar keeping our 12 drivers employed. But while I was meticulously rationing my monthly eye care, soaking my daily wear contacts in generic $2 saline solutions for weeks past their expiration date because a $65 replacement box would wreck my personal groceries, the executive dividend ledger told a completely different story. Juliana had married my older brother Julian 3 years ago. She walked into our modest dispatch office wearing a tailored gray wool blazer and carrying a sleek Italian leather laptop sleeve, immediately declaring herself our new executive strategy consultant. Within 6 months, her name was on the corporate banking resolution as Chief Restructuring Officer. She talked in this fast-clipped corporate cadence, constantly dropping terms like exit multiples, capital efficiency, and operational liability restructuring. And my brother just stared at her like she was a prophet who had descended from heaven to save us from our own small-town dirt. The crazy part is, I actually tried to trust her at first. But then came my 10-year employment anniversary with Vance Logistics. That was the exact week I spent 80 hours straight pulling all-nighters to reconcile our regional fuel vendor accounts, single-handedly preventing a bank lien that would have shuttered our fleet. I walked into the main terminal on Friday expecting maybe a shared sheet cake or a brief thank you from the board. Instead, Juliana had called a mandatory company-wide assembly. She hired a local catering team, set up audio speakers near the loading bay, and took the microphone in front of all 40 employees. She didn't mention my name once. Instead, she announced that she was accepting the Regional Chamber of Commerce's award for Visionary Leadership and Corporate Turnaround. She held up a heavy, custom-engraved crystal trophy, smiling for a hired photographer while I stood in the back row by the grease trap, holding a cold paper cup of tap water, my left eye throbbing violently from a fresh corneal scratch. Whenever the physical pain in my eyes got too sharp, I would reach into the bottom drawer of my metal filing cabinet and touch the faded, ink-stained inventory binder my father left me. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger with yellowed pages, filled with his tight, purple ink handwriting from 30 years ago. My dad built this company from a single flatbed truck. He taught me how to read shipping manifests when I was 7 years old, sitting on an upside-down wooden crate in the old yard. Maya, he used to tell me, his thumbs stained with grease and indelible ink. A smooth talker can lie about how many crates are on the floor, but the ledger never lies. Real value is meticulously tracked, never blindly trusted. That binder was my anchor. It reminded me that while Juliana and Julian were drinking $60 bottles of Cabernet at the downtown country club, the physical reality of this business lived and died on the accuracy of the floor count. And that brings me to the piece of paper sitting right next to my mechanical keyboard. 3 days ago, right after Juliana held a closed-door meeting with our legal counsel, I went to the main office floor to retrieve a batch of bill of lading printouts. Sitting in the output tray of the shared laser printer, forgotten under a stack of blank letterhead, was a single invoice. It was heavily redacted with black marker across the header, but the line items were crystal clear. $40,000 charged to Vance Logistics for enterprise cloud management and software consulting. It was signed by Juliana. When I brought the paper back to my office, Tyler, the 26-year-old junior executive Juliana hired straight out of business school to handle her digital communications, was standing in my doorway. Tyler wore crisp spread-collar shirts, spent half his workday polishing his leather Oxfords, and never missed an opportunity to deliver a condescending jab. He saw me holding the invoice, leaned against my doorframe with a smirking sneer, and said, well, basically he chuckled right in my face, telling me not to worry my little head over high-level corporate software contracts, reminding me that I was just a bean counter who belonged behind the inventory desk. Julian was no better. Whenever I tried to pull my brother aside in the hallway to ask why our maintenance reserves were being drained while vendor bills were defaulting, he wouldn't even meet my eyes. He'd stare down at his phone, tapping his foot nervously, repeating whatever script Juliana had fed him that morning. Look, Maya, he'd mumble, you just don't understand the macroeconomics of modern logistics. Juliana is streamlining our operational overhead so we can scale. She's saving us. He was completely paralyzed, brainwashed into believing that surrendering every scrap of family authority to his new wife was the only heroic choice. And if I dared to push back, Juliana would casually bring up my 8-year-old niece Lily, Julian's daughter from his first marriage, a sweet, quiet kid with severe type 1 diabetes. Juliana would smile, sipping her artisan green tea, and offhandedly remark that if our operational costs didn't come down immediately, the board would be forced to reevaluate the executive health insurance tier, subtly reminding me that Lily's continuous glucose monitor and insulin coverage were entirely at her mercy. The only human being in that entire facility who didn't look at me like I was a ghost was Mac. Mac was our head freight dispatcher, a gray-haired, cynical veteran who had been working our loading dock since I was in diapers. Every morning at 5 o'clock, before the sun even cleared the pine trees behind the gravel yard, Mac would walk into my back office carrying 2 cheap styrofoam cups of black diner coffee. He'd set one on my desk, lean his heavy shoulders against my filing cabinet, and watch me cross-reference the morning freight logs. He didn't offer fake sympathy or flowery advice. He just kept me grounded in the concrete truth of the yard. And now, here I was, sitting in the dark at 3 o'clock, staring at that gray progress bar creeping toward the finish line. Equity transfer pending, 142.18 remaining. Juliana believed she had executed the perfect corporate execution. She had engineered artificial vendor defaults, convinced the board we were bankrupt, and backed my brother into a corner where his only option was to sign an emergency restructuring contract that transferred 80% of Vance Logistics directly into an offshore structured LLC that she owned alone. She thought I was isolated. She thought I was too broken, too tired, and too poor to fight back. She didn't know that 3 hours ago, while she was out at an expensive bistro celebrating her upcoming equity takeover, I had taken that redacted $40,000 software invoice and started digging into the numerical anatomy of the transaction. She didn't know that in the world of supply chain accounting, every merchant account leaves a digital footprint that no amount of slick corporate talk can erase. And as I looked at the red blinking indicator on my second monitor, I felt the cold, hard weight of my father's inventory binder resting against my legs. The timer was ticking down. But I wasn't running away. I was just getting ready to audit. It started on a Tuesday morning with 3 certified late notice letters from our primary regional fuel distributor sitting right on top of my keyboard. $214,000 in unpaid diesel invoices. I knew for a fact we had the liquidity in our primary operating account. I had verified the cash balance myself 48 hours prior. But when I logged into the bank portal, the funds weren't there. They had been rerouted into a temporary escrow lockbox marked Corporate Restructuring Contingency. 10 minutes later, Juliana walked into my windowless office. She was wearing a tailored $3,000 slate gray linen blazer, carrying a porcelain cup of steamed oat milk latte. She looked down at the 3 red stamp notices on my desk, her face entirely devoid of panic. Instead, she offered me a soft, condescending smile that made my stomach curdle. She reached into her leather handbag, pulled out a cheap paper sleeve, and set it directly over the unpaid bills. It was a $10 generic Starbucks e-gift card, attached to a bright yellow post-it note that read, "Thanks for all your extra admin help during the transition." She didn't even look at me when she spoke. She just glanced at her manicured nails and told me in that calm, airy voice that the vendor defaults were simply a necessary operational lever to demonstrate financial distress to the board, forcing an emergency equity consolidation. She was intentionally sabotaging our credit line, driving my father's business toward artificial insolvency just so she could swoop in as the savior. My vision flared. A sharp, stinging pain radiated across my left eye as my expired, dried-out contact lens scraped against my cornea. My throat felt like dry sand, my chest caving in under a sudden, suffocating weight. My internal processing grid dropped to 0 frames per second, my lungs stalling like an unprimed diesel pump while the room seemed to tilt on its axis. If you've ever had to stare at a $10 gift card left on your desk while realizing you've been made the family scapegoat for a narcissistic sister-in-law's financial abuse, tell me how you survived that first hour without dropping to the floor. How do you keep breathing when you realize the people who share your blood are actively liquidating your life's work right in front of your face? I snatched the 3 default notices, shoved the $10 gift card into my pocket, and marched straight into the executive hallway. I found Julian standing outside the main glass conference room, holding a tablet while Tyler, that sleek junior executive, showed him a glossy digital presentation of Juliana's new corporate logo. "Julian, we have a catastrophic problem," I said, my voice cracking, holding out the paper. "The fuel distributor just locked our accounts. The trucks can't fill up tomorrow morning. Juliana locked $200,000 in escrow." "Maya, please lower your voice." Julian cut in immediately, taking a step back and waving his hand dismissively. He wouldn't look at my face. He just stared at the wall behind my shoulder. "We're in the middle of a strategic planning session." "Strategic?" I stepped closer, my hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. "She's intentionally defaulting on our suppliers. She's manufacturing a bankruptcy so you'll sign over the equity." Juliana stepped out of the conference room, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She didn't look angry. She looked mildly amused, like a mother watching a toddler throw a harmless tantrum. "Julian, darling," she said softly, placing a manicured hand on his forearm. "I warned you that Maya was experiencing extreme burnout. Her hostility is becoming a real liability for the board." "I'm not burnt out. You're stealing the company," I shouted, turning on her. "You forged those restructuring numbers!" "Maya." Julian finally looked at me, his face twisting into a pathetic, cowardly grimace. "Look, you two just have different management styles, okay? You're looking at short-term invoices and Juliana is looking at the macroeconomics. She made a minor calculation error on the escrow timing, but your constant hostility is what's making this whole merger so difficult." "A calculation error?" I stammered, completely stunned by the sheer audacity. "Julian, she locked our operating cash." "And if you keep escalating this dramatic performance," Juliana interrupted, her voice dropping into a cold, dangerous whisper, "we will be forced to reevaluate our administrative overhead immediately, starting with the dependent health insurance benefits for non-executive staff." The air left my lungs. She was talking about Lily, my 8-year-old niece, my brother's diabetic daughter. "The board is reviewing our healthcare policy tiers tonight," Juliana continued, taking a slow sip of her latte. "Continuous glucose monitors and brand-name insulin analogs are extremely expensive line items. If you create friction during the equity transfer, well, we'll just have to trim the healthcare budget to cover your vendor errors." Julian didn't say a word. He just stared at his shoes, his mouth half open, completely silent, while his wife weaponized his own daughter's medical care to silence me. Tyler stepped up behind Juliana, adjusting his silver tie clip, and let out a quiet, mocking chuckle. "Look, Maya," Tyler smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Maybe you should just go back to your office and let the real executives handle the balance sheet. You're just a bean counter." After all, I stood there in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by glass walls and expensive mahogany trim, completely paralyzed. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight. They had tied a rope around my niece's neck and handed me the bill. I turned around, my boots heavy on the floorboards, and walked back to the back office in absolute silence. I shut the door behind me. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I sat down in my squeaky vinyl office chair, pulled my knees up against the metal edge of the desk, and stared at the dual monitors glowing in the dark. On the screen, the ERP accounting software was open. A stark red system alert banner sat dead center on the display. "Equity restructuring approval required. Action pending." My hand moved to the keyboard. I pressed the spacebar. Flash. I pressed it again. Flash. Again. Flash. I sat there in the dark for 20 minutes, blindly hitting that single key, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical click echoing off the cinder block walls. It's a terrifying thing to stare at the people who share your blood and realize you are nothing more than a misclassified ledger entry to them. You spend 10 years skipping eye doctor appointments, breathing diesel fumes in a windowless room, convincing yourself that if you just patch the financial leaks, they'll finally validate your existence. But you cannot audit a corporate structure that requires your complete biological exhaustion to stay afloat. They don't want a sister or a partner. They want a human escrow account, someone to silently absorb the brutal reality of their fake executive vanity so they never have to look at their own deficit. The immense physical energy it takes to constantly reconcile their fraudulent inputs doesn't just exhaust you. It fundamentally burns out your capacity to care. I spent a decade acting as an operational blast shield for a brother who weaponized his own cowardice, and a sister-in-law who outsourced her soul to a spreadsheet. And the absolute cruelest part? They will sip artisanal coffee tomorrow morning, completely unbothered, while I sit in this dark room calculating exactly how long it takes for them to cut a diabetic child's lifeline. A single tear slipped down my left cheek, stinging terribly as it hit the scratched surface of my cornea. But I wasn't just crying about the money, or the stolen company, or the $6 hour I was being paid. I was mourning a ghost. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my father's old inventory binder. I ran my thumb over the frayed leather cover, remembering a humid July afternoon 20 years ago. I was 10 years old. Julian was 14. Our dad had taken us to the yard to teach us how to audit flatbed trailers. Julian had spent 3 hours in the blistering sun helping me lift heavy wooden pallets, laughing, wiping grease off my nose with his sleeve, swearing to Dad that he would always protect the family business. And protect me. That 14-year-old boy was dead. The man standing in the hallway was just a hollow shell, an empty puppet who would stand by and let his own child's medicine be threatened just to keep his wife's vanity project alive. The tears stopped. The stinging in my left eye dulled into a cold, persistent thrum. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, pulled my legs down from the chair, and let out a long, shaky breath. The morning was over. The family was gone. There was no brother left to save, no loyalty left to honor, and no peace left to keep. I looked up at the red banner on my monitor. I didn't see my family anymore. I didn't see a sister-in-law or a brother. My mind stripped away the names, the blood ties, and the emotional noise, filtering the entire situation through the strict, cold reality of my trade. This wasn't a family feud. This was a massive, unreconciled operational variance. It was a severe compliance violation, a catastrophic inventory drain that had been allowed to rot the foundation of this company for 3 years. And in the world of inventory operations, when you find a rogue element systematically falsifying the ledger to cover up shrinkage, you don't argue with them. You don't scream. You audit them out of the system. I pulled the keyboard toward me, opened the master terminal, and began typing in the administrator command prompts to pull every raw transaction log from the past 36 months. The hunter had just entered the ledger. The digital clock on the bottom right corner of my desktop display read 3:14 a.m. The building was dead silent, save for the low, erratic hum of the air handling unit in the ceiling and the rhythmic ticking of the heavy transformer box outside the window. Cold air seeped through the cracks in the cinder block wall, settling around my ankles. My left eye was throbbing with a dry, white-hot friction, that scratched cornea protesting against the 16 straight hours I had spent staring into the blinding white light of dual 24-inch monitors. On my desk sat the redacted invoice, next to a lukewarm cup of instant coffee that had formed a thin, oily film across its surface. My fingers hover over the mechanical keyboard, and then the fear hit me. It wasn't a slow realization. It was a sudden, violent, biological wave that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. My throat felt like it was closing off completely, my lungs refusing to expand as a cold sweat broke out across the nape of my neck. My hands started shaking so violently that my palm slipped off the plastic casing of the mouse. Look, you have to understand the sheer, terrifying weight of the scapegoat reflex. When you have spent 3 years being systematically told that you are crazy, that you are paranoid, that you are just a bitter, burnt-out, low-level worker who doesn't understand high-level business, your first instinct when you find something wrong isn't triumph. It's terror. I stared at the screen, hyperventilating in the dark room, listening to the echo of Julian's voice in my head. You're hostile, Maya. You're making this merger difficult. You're suffering from severe burnout. For almost 2 full minutes, my index finger hovered over the blue Delete File button on the audit portal. I actually thought about shutting the computer down. I thought about packing my dad's old inventory binder into my canvas bag, driving back to my cramped apartment, and just letting them take the company. If I pushed this button, if I brought this evidence into the light, I would be destroying the fragile illusion of peace my family had maintained for years. I would be declaring war on my brother's wife. I would be forcing Julian to confront the monster he had married. My chest caved in under the sheer weight of the panic. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing the heels of my palms against my eye sockets until bright bursts of purple light flashed behind my eyelids. Just press delete, the cowardly voice whispered in my mind. Keep the peace. Don't be the one who burns it down. Then, my hand brushed against the corner of my father's leather-bound ledger resting on my lap. The rough, worn calfskin. The faint smell of machine oil and purple ink. And right beside it, the memory of my 8-year-old niece, Lily, holding her little stuffed bear in the hallway while her stepmother casually used her diabetic medical supplies as leverage to silence me. My eyes snapped open. The tremor in my right hand stopped instantly. The fear didn't disappear. It simply transformed. It crystallized into a cold, dense mass in the pit of my chest. I pulled my hand away from the delete button, grabbed the mouse with a firm grip, and opened the Master ACH Clearinghouse portal for Vance Logistics. Because I am an inventory operations auditor, I don't deal in corporate theater, emotional rhetoric, or executive posturing. I deal in numerical reconciliation. In my world, every physical item that enters a warehouse leaves a digital shadow, and every dollar that leaves an account leaves a cryptographic routing trail. Juliana thought she was a financial mastermind because she could drop MBA buzzwords in front of a mirror. But she didn't know the first rule of supply chain accounting. The clearinghouse never forgets a code. I pulled up the raw ISO 8583 transaction payload for the $40,000 transfer marked Enterprise Cloud Infrastructure Solutions, LLC. This was the invoice Juliana had claimed was an urgent, non-negotiable payment to a Silicon Valley software consulting group. I didn't just look at the PDF invoice. PDF invoices are just electronic paper. Anyone with a graphics editing software can make one in 5 minutes. I bypassed the front-end billing dashboard entirely and accessed the underlying banking metadata log, the unedited, automated routing header generated by the Federal Reserve's automated clearinghouse network when the wire cleared. My eyes narrowed as I zoomed in on line 42 of the raw text string. There it was, a 4-digit numerical string embedded directly into the settlement header. MCC 0763. In commercial merchant processing, every business that accepts credit cards or electronic wire transfers is assigned a standardized 4-digit merchant category code by the credit card associations and banking networks. Software developers and cloud infrastructure firms are categorized under MCC 5734 or MCC 7372. Code 0763 had nothing to do with enterprise software. My inventory training kicked in instantly. Code 0763 is the global, non-negotiable banking standard for agricultural cooperatives, livestock feed, and grain wholesalers. I sat completely still in the dark, the blue light reflecting off my glasses, listening to my own shallow breathing. The great Silicon Valley Cloud Infrastructure Company was registered as a farm supply store. I opened the State Secretary of Business Registry portal on my second monitor, typed in the tax identification number extracted from line 44 of the banking log, and hit execute. The screen refreshed instantly, displaying the unedited Public Corporate Filing Certificate. State Department of Corporate Filings. Entity record. Entity name. Crestview Grain and Livestock Feed Cooperative, LLC. Registered business category. Wholesale agricultural feeds and animal husbandry. Primary officers. Arthur Vance, Juliana Vance. Physical address. 1408 Old County Road 9, Oconee County. Routing settlement status. Active. Clearing account. Arthur Vance, Juliana's biological father, a retired cattle farmer living 2 hours west of the city. Juliana hadn't hired a high-end software consulting firm to optimize our logistics network. She had created a fake corporate shell entity using her maiden name, filed the single page of DBA paperwork in a rural county court, assigned it a livestock merchant classification, and was quietly wiring $40,000 of our freight revenue directly into her father's agricultural bank account every 90 days under the label of cloud consulting. My mind didn't jump to anger. It moved with the cold, systematic precision of a mechanical sorting belt. Proof 1 was secure. The core deception was absolute. I didn't stop there. An auditor never stops at the first leak. You trace the entire pipe until you find the structural breach. I opened the Corporate Debt Liability Registry, the private portal where commercial lenders verify existing corporate guarantees before issuing new lines of credit. If Juliana was siphoning $40,000 a quarter, she needed a buffer to cover the cash flow deficits she was creating in our operating accounts. I searched our corporate EIN against the Regional Commercial Lending Registry. 3 minutes later, a locked PDF attachment downloaded to my local drive. It was a high-risk commercial promissory note issued 6 weeks ago by a private mezzanine lender for $150,000, carrying an extortionate 18.5% interest rate. I scrolled straight down to the signature block at the bottom of page 12. Commercial promissory note and individual guarantee. Borrower entity. Vance Logistics, LLC. Sole personal guarantor. Julian Vance. Principal amount? $150,000 USD. Security pledge. Primary residential deed and personal equity stock. Digital execution certificate. DocuSign ID number 88492-AX. Signer verification IP 172.56.42.109. I stared at the IP address string. 172.56.42.109. That wasn't the office router. It wasn't my brother's laptop. That was the private static IP address assigned to the home Wi-Fi network at Juliana's personal residence, executed late on a Sunday night when Julian was fast asleep after taking a heavy dose of his prescribed sleep aid. She hadn't just used the company as leverage. She had secretly forged my brother's digital signature on a personal guarantee contract, tying his personal name, his house, and his entire life's financial existence to a predatory $150,000 high-interest loan. She was using that loan cash to fund the fake software invoices, laundering the borrowed capital through her father's livestock entity to secure the liquid cash deposit she needed to buy her way into the prestige membership tier at the local country club. She was setting up the company to implode, planning to let Vance Logistics go into default, while she walked away with the equity in her private LLC and left my brother personally liable for every cent of the debt. I sat back in my chair. The clock on my screen changed to 3:48 a.m. The room was freezing, but my hands were completely warm. The dry, painful rasp in my left eye didn't bother me anymore. The gaslight hangover, that suffocating fog of doubt, guilt, and fear that had paralyzed me for 3 years, was completely, permanently gone. I reached for my dad's old inventory binder, opened it to the very last blank page, and wrote 3 things down in neat, precise ink. Merchant category code 0763. Civil fraud, agricultural conversion, $40,000. DocuSign IP audit trail number 88492-AX. Unlawful identity attachment and forgery, $150,000. Shared cloud audit trail. Live synchronization pending. There was no more confusion, no more self-doubt. The math was reconciled. The inventory variance had been located, and the rogue element was fully documented. I closed the binder, pulled up my secure cloud storage portal, and began setting up the automated distribution protocol. By 4:15 a.m., the dark back office felt like a cold pressure vault. The air coming off the alleyway outside was damp with morning fog, carrying the sharp smell of wet pavement and diesel fumes from the first long-haul rig pulling into the gravel staging area. My fingers were slick with cold sweat against the rubberized grip of my computer mouse. Because pulling the thread on Juliana's fake livestock company was only half the battle. If I walked into that conference room later today and dropped those fraudulent merchant codes onto the table, she would instantly reach for her sharpest weapon. She would execute her threat against Lily. She would strip my 8-year-old niece's health coverage before the ink on my audit report was even dry. And so, I had to build a concrete bunker around that child before the sun came up. I opened the secure ERISA Benefits Administration gateway on my secondary monitor. My left eye was throbbing in sharp, rhythmic pulses, every microfiction of that scratched contact lens reminding me that time was bleeding out. As the inventory operations auditor, I had high-level administrative access to our master payroll registry and group health policy contracts. Access Juliana had completely overlooked because she assumed I only used the portal to log basic hours and print pay stubs. My hands were cold. I opened the original 30-page health underwriter charter established when my father was still running the company 15 years ago. I didn't search for corporate fluff. I scrolled straight down to the fine print on page 22. Section 14, subsection B, the Dependent Equity Protection Clause. There it was, a single, forgotten procedural iron gate my dad had built into the original company bylaws to protect our family during lean market years. The charter explicitly stated that health insurance benefits for direct line dependents of founding Class A equity holders could not be modified, downgraded, or revoked through board resolution alone. Any administrative alteration required a 90-day written notice and a 100% unanimous consent vote from all primary stock owners. And here's the thing. I still owned 20% of the founding Class A equity. Juliana had 80% of the operating control through her temporary management contract, but she didn't own the underlying charter stock yet. Not until that equity transfer progress bar on my main monitor hit 0 at the end of the day. At 5:45 a.m., I picked up my desk phone. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, the plastic receiver cold and slightly slippery in my sweating palm. I dialed the direct internal compliance line for our regional health insurance provider's legal risk division. The static on the line hissed softly while the automated system routed the call. A sleepy professional voice answered on the fourth ring. Corporate compliance, state your group policy clearance code. Group policy 8847, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, leaning close to the mouthpiece so the sound wouldn't carry into the hallway. This is Maya Vance, 20% Class A equity holder and primary operations administrator for Vance Logistics. I am filing an immediate emergency administrative freeze under ERISA Section 502. State the basis for the freeze, Ms. Vance. An unauthorized officer, Chief Restructuring Officer Juliana Vance, is attempting an illegal, non-unanimous benefit reduction targeting a Tier 1 diabetic minor dependent. DocuSign clearance ID pending, I said, my words coming out in short, clipped, precise bursts. I am invoking my statutory Class A veto right under subsection 14B to lock the dependent policy baseline immediately. A long, agonizing pause stretched across the line. The only sound in the dark office was the low, rhythmic thud of a truck idling in the staging yard outside. Thump, thump, thump. I held my breath, my knees trembling so violently under the desk that they bumped against the metal frame of my filing cabinet. Keyboard keys clacked rapidly on the other end of the phone. Verifying equity registry. Confirmed, the compliance officer said flatly. Ms. Vance, under Section 14B, an emergency lockbox hold has been applied to dependent ID line 04. Lily Vance. Continuous glucose monitor authorizations, brand name insulin analogs, and primary care coverage are locked into an irrevocable 6-month administrative freeze. No corporate officer or board resolution can alter or cancel this policy without a signed federal court order. Send the confirmation receipt to my encrypted private email, I whispered. Not the master corporate inbox. Receipt transmitted. The hold is active as of 6:02 a.m. I hung up the receiver. It settled into the plastic cradle with a dull, heavy click. I sank back into my vinyl chair and let out a long, ragged breath that rattled in my throat. I pulled my tablet toward me, watched the encrypted PDF confirmation file download into my local drive, and verified the digital seal. The leverage was dead. Juliana was going to walk into that lawyer's conference room later today believing she held a knife to my niece's throat. She was going to smile her polished, condescending corporate smile, tilt her head, and subtly threaten Lily's medicine to make me sign away my father's business. She had no idea that I had just disarmed her in the dark. The blade was gone, the concrete was poured, and for the first time in 3 long, suffocating years, I knew I was going to walk into that room and tear her entire fake world down to the ground. The fluorescent lights in the main administrative hallway flickered awake at 7 in the morning, buzzing with a sharp, high-pitched hum that vibrated right through the soles of my work boots. I stepped out of my dark back office, carefully adjusting my slump, letting my shoulders drop, making sure my chin stayed glued to my chest. I needed them to see a defeated woman. I needed Juliana and my brother to look at me and see exhausted, broken scapegoat who was finally ready to sign whatever paper they pushed across the mahogany table. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a sharp, double vibration from the master family group chat. The one that included our cousins, my aunt, and 3 senior employees. I pulled out my phone, leaning my shoulder against the cold metal doorframe of the supply closet. Juliana had been active since 6 a.m. She was executing her subtle smear campaign under the guise of deep, heartfelt concern. I scrolled through the messages. "Good morning, everyone," she had typed at 6:14 a.m. "Just wanted to ask for your prayers for Maya today. She's been experiencing such severe burnout and emotional instability lately. It's breaking Julian's heart. We're doing our absolute best to gently guide her through this corporate transition today, but please be patient with her if she acts out. Modern business growth can be so overwhelming for people who aren't equipped for high-level operations." I stared at the screen, my thumb resting lightly on the glass. The audacity was almost impressive. She was preemptively painting me as an unstable lunatic so that when I walked into that afternoon meeting, anyone in the building would dismiss my warnings as a hysterical breakdown. And then, the unthinkable happened. At 7:22 a.m., a new message popped up in that exact same group chat. It wasn't a sympathetic update. It was a direct copy-paste of a private instruction sent by Juliana's account in sheer, careless haste. "Make sure Maya signs the emergency restructuring waiver before 5 p.m. today so the health benefits transfer smoothly. And don't let her see the attached loan guarantor addendum." The message sat there on the screen for 3 seconds. 3 agonizing, static seconds. My heart stopped in my chest. And then, poof, this message was recalled by the sender. A microsecond later, Juliana typed a frantic follow-up. "Oops, so sorry everyone, wrong chat. That was meant for our external legal team regarding administrative paperwork. Ignore." She thought she was fast. She thought recall functions erased mistakes, but an inventory operations auditor lives by the timestamp. The second that text hit my screen, before her thumb could even reach the delete prompt, my muscle memory had already executed a full screen capture. The unedited image, showing her account name, the exact timestamp of 7:22:14 a.m., and her explicit instruction to hide the guarantor addendum from me, was automatically saved to my local camera roll and pushed directly to my encrypted secondary server. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just tucked the phone back into my pocket, walked into the main executive suite, and assumed my submissive role. By 8:30, Juliana was sitting behind her massive glass desk, sipping an $8 iced matcha latte, her designer hair clipped back in a flawless silver clasp. She looked up at me as I stood in her doorway, holding a heavy roll of industrial carpet cleaner and a box of display boards she had demanded I set up for the afternoon legal presentation. "Oh, Maya, good," she said smoothly, not even looking at my face, waving her hand casually toward a dark coffee stain on the cream-colored area rug near her feet. "Tyler spilled his espresso earlier. Wipe that up before the corporate lawyers arrive at 2. And make sure the display boards are perfectly straight. We can't have the office looking shabby when counsel arrives." I didn't argue. I dropped to my knees on the cold floor, pulled a rag from my bucket, and began scrubbing the rug, the sharp chemical tang of aerosol fabric spray filling my throat. As I worked on my hands and knees, Juliana leaned back in her leather executive chair, dialed her phone on speaker, and spent 15 minutes loudly complaining to her dealership agent about a 2-week shipping delay on her custom-ordered luxury SUV, whining about how agonizing it was to drive a base-model loaner car to her country club interviews. Look, if you've ever had to literally scrub the floor on your knees in front of someone wearing a $3,000 suit who just stole your life's work while complaining that their luxury sports car delivery was delayed 2 weeks, tell me how you kept your jaw wired shut. Where do you find the sheer, terrifying willpower to swallow that humiliation for 5 more hours just to make sure the trap is locked so tight they can't even breathe when it springs? I finished scrubbing the rug, wiped my hands on my work apron, and walked quietly out of her office without saying a single word. By 10 in the morning, I was back in my dark office, setting up the digital execution delivery. I didn't create a paper folder. Paper folders can be snatched, hidden, or torn up in a fit of rage. Instead, I opened our master cloud network, the shared enterprise drive that our corporate legal counsel, the board, and the executive team used for official document archives. I created a new, restricted access folder in the primary root directory titled Vance Logistics Reconciliation.zip. Inside that folder, I uploaded 4 unredacted, time-stamped digital files. First, the raw ISO 8583 banking payload showing the MCC 0763 merchant code, proving the $40,000 software consulting fee was wired directly to an agricultural livestock feed store owned by Juliana's father. Second, the complete DocuSign IP audit log number 88492-AX, showing the forged digital signature on the $150,000 commercial loan, executed from Juliana's home IP address late at night. Third, the high-resolution screenshot of her recalled group chat message, proving she consciously conspired to conceal the personal liability addendum from both me and my brother. And fourth, the official ERISA Section 502 healthcare freeze receipt, proving Lily's medical coverage was permanently locked under Class A equity protection and could never be used as leverage again. I didn't send the link. Not yet. I set up an automated encrypted routing script linked to my tablet. With one single tap on my screen, the shared drive permissions would unlock, and an automated broadcast email containing the unredacted download key would be pushed simultaneously to every corporate lawyer in the firm, the board of directors, and the state civil fraud division. At 11 o'clock, 2 hours before the trap was set to spring, I walked out to the loading dock to get some air. The sky was overcast, a cold gray drizzle starting to mist over the gravel yard. Mac was standing near the edge of Dock 3, holding 2 cheap styrofoam cups of black diner coffee. The smell of hot coffee and diesel exhaust was the most honest thing in that entire complex. He turned, looked at my face, and handed me a cup without a word. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't ask why I had spent 16 hours in the dark behind dual monitors. He just leaned his heavy forearm against the steel guardrail, took a sip of his coffee, and looked out at the line of semi-trucks parked in the yard. "You look like you haven't slept in 3 days, kid," Max said softly, his voice gravelly from 40 years of shouting over truck engines. "I haven't," I whispered, holding the warm cup with both hands, watching the steam rise into the cold drizzle. "I'm ending it today, Mac." Mac was silent for a long time. He looked at the trucks, then down at his worn leather work boots, then turned his head to stare straight into my eyes. "A forged shipping manifest still won't make the truck arrive," Mac said flatly, his voice carrying the deep, unbreakable weight of the loading dock. "But you've been paying their operational deficits with your own health for way too long. Real family isn't the people who mathematically calculate how much free labor they can strip from you while keeping their own suits clean. It's the people who never once pulled out a spreadsheet to figure out what your loyalty cost. Stop reconciling their bad checks. I stood there in the cold drizzle, taking a small sip of the bitter black coffee, feeling the heat spread down into my chest. The words settled into my bones like iron rebar. Mac was right. The smooth-talking executives in their gray wool suits were just noise. The real foundation of this company was built on the concrete, the diesel, and the numbers that never lied. I tossed my empty paper cup into the recycling bin, adjusted the collar of my worn jacket, and walked back inside to wait for 2 o'clock. The wall-mounted analog clock above the mahogany doorframe clicked with a heavy mechanical thud as the red second hand swept past the 12. Exactly 2 p.m. The air inside the main corporate conference room was thick, sterile, and cold, smelling faintly of citrus-scented furniture polish, dry erase chemicals, and stale roast coffee cooling in white ceramic cups. Sunlight filtered weakly through the floor-to-ceiling glass paneling, casting long, pale grid lines across the mirror-polished surface of a 20-foot mahogany conference table. Sitting at the head of the table was Mr. Harrison, the senior corporate attorney hired by the board, flanked by a younger associate holding a leather-bound legal ledger. Across from them sat Juliana, dressed in a tailored slate-gray designer suit, her hair styled in a flawless silver clip, her laptop open to a blank presentation slide. My brother Julian sat to her left, his posture stiff, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white, staring intently at a glass pitcher of ice water resting on a silver tray. I walked in quietly, carrying my beat-up tablet under my arm, and took a seat at the far end of the table. I wore my usual dark blue work blazer, the fabric worn smooth at the elbows, carrying the subtle, lingering scent of diesel exhaust from Dock 3. Tyler, the junior executive sitting next to Juliana, leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his silver tie clip. He glanced over at my cuffs, let out a quiet, audible puff of air through his nose, and looked over at the corporate lawyers. He remarked in a loud, casual tone that the yard administration must have forgotten to issue a dress code reminder for high-level legal proceedings, asking with a slight chuckle if I had brought grease towels from the loading dock to protect the mahogany wood. Before the lead attorney could even open his legal folder, Juliana held up a single manicured hand, offering a soft, theatrical sigh. She stood up from her leather chair, her heels clicking crisply against the hardwood floor. She walked around the table until she was standing directly beside my seat. She reached out with both hands and, without asking, forcefully grabbed the lapels of my frayed blazer, yanking the heavy fabric straight with a sharp, firm jerk that pinched the skin at the back of my neck against my collar. She smoothed down my shoulders with patronizing, exaggerated care, looking across the room at the 2 attorneys with a look of practiced, sorrowful pity. She whispered loudly enough for every person in the room to hear, telling me that she really felt obligated to help me look presentable, stating that showing up to a high-stakes corporate restructuring meeting in worn-out yard clothes was just embarrassing for the brand, offhandedly offering to deduct the cost of a proper department store suit from my final severance payout. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I sat completely still, feeling the coarse fabric biting into my neck, watching a tiny bead of sweat trace a slow line down my brother's jaw. Juliana walked back to her seat, smoothed her designer skirt, and rested her forearms on the polished wood. She looked directly at Mr. Harrison and delivered her opening remarks in that smooth, melodious corporate tone she had perfected. She explained that this emergency equity consolidation was purely an act of strategic necessity, a vital step to protect her own peace and establish healthy boundaries against what she called toxic, outdated family sentimentality. She spoke at length about how legacy logistics entities often rot from within because founding families refuse to trim their operational dead weight, claiming with absolute calm that relieving me of my administrative duties was the kindest thing the board could do for my long-term well-being. Across the table, my brother Julian just sat there. His lips were pressed into a thin, white line, his eyes glued to his lap, completely silent while his wife spun her narrative. He was acting like a ghost in his own life, totally surrendered to the corporate illusion she had built around him. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and slid a thick 30-page document bound in blue cardstock across the table toward my seat. The signature line at the bottom of the equity surrender agreement was highlighted with a bright yellow arrow sticker. Juliana picked up her expensive gold-trimmed pen, clicked the top button with a sharp metallic snap that echoed off the glass walls, and set the pen down directly on top of the contract, right next to my hand. I looked down at that highlighted yellow arrow. I looked across the table at Juliana, her chin tilted up, her eyes bright with absolute, undisputed triumph as she waited for me to sign away my father's legacy. And honestly, I just froze for a second. The room went completely dead silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the ceiling projector fan and a single piece of ice shifting and clinking inside the glass pitcher on the tray. I looked at her raising her chin, her smile tight and cold, and I wondered if she had any idea how fast a fake empire burns when you cut the oxygen. Because a single tap on the tablet resting in my lap was about to answer that for everyone in this room. I didn't touch the gold pen. I didn't even look at the yellow arrow sticker pointing to the signature line. Instead, I reached under the rim of the heavy mahogany table, my fingers digging into the worn denim of my jeans, pressing my knees tightly together to stop the violent adrenaline tremor that was rattling through my legs. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a heavy engine running with an unseated valve, my left cornea stinging as a fresh, dry tear cut across the scratched surface. But when I spoke, my voice didn't sound like mine. It came out flat, clinical, completely stripped of human inflection, like an automated transit recording reading weather coordinates over a shortwave radio. Section 3 of the proposed equity absorption agreement references a $40,000 quarterly operational liability, I said, my eyes fixed entirely on the blank glass wall behind the corporate attorney's head, refusing to make eye contact with Juliana or my brother. Described in the annex as proprietary software consulting fees paid to Enterprise Cloud Infrastructure Solutions, LLC. Juliana let out a quiet, dramatic puff of air through her nose, resting her elbows on the polished wood. Mr. Harrison, she said smoothly, turning to the senior lawyer with a patronizing tilt of her head. As I mentioned, Maya suffers from cognitive overload when reviewing high-level corporate structures. We don't need to waste billable legal hours walking a low-level clerk through standard vendor line items. The automated clearinghouse transaction payload for that $40,000 transfer was routed under Federal Reserve Settlement Sequence 884. I continued, speaking right over her, my voice maintaining the exact same dull, monotone frequency. Line 42 of the raw ISO data header contains a 4-digit merchant classification code, MCC 0763. That code is assigned exclusively by the Banking Association to wholesale agricultural feeds and animal husbandry. Silence descended on the room. Cold, heavy, and absolute. Mr. Harrison stopped mid-gesture. His hand remained suspended 2 inches above his leather notepad. He slowly lifted his head, his half-moon reading glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose, his eyes locking onto my face. The registered legal entity tied to that clearing account, I said, my voice unyielding, is Crestview Grain and Livestock Feed Cooperative, LLC, filed in Oconee County. The registered agent on the certificate is Juliana Vance. The managing member is Arthur Vance, her biological father. The $40,000 charged to Vance Logistics for software infrastructure was wired directly into a rural farm feed store account 60 miles west of here. Juliana's polished smile didn't fade, but the skin around her mouth tightened instantly, turning a pale, waxy white. That is an absurd misinterpretation of an internal routing classification, she said, her voice rising half an octave, her fingers tapping a rapid, frantic rhythm against her leather notebook. Those operational files are encrypted on a local drive. You don't have administrative clearance to access corporate banking payloads, Maya. Mr. Harrison, please inform her that internal documents are confidential property. You're looking at a live shared drive audit trail, I said softly, tapping the glass screen of my tablet twice. Across the table, the associate attorney's laptop chimed with a crisp, low digital notification tone. The young lawyer looked down at his monitor, his brow furrowing as a new folder automatically populated across the enterprise network. The shared cloud directory was unlocked at 1:58 p.m., I stated, keeping my posture entirely rigid, my hands resting flat on the table. Look at line 4 of the system access log, Mr. Harrison. You'll see a time-stamped read receipt. At 2:01 p.m., the entire unredacted agricultural ledger, along with the raw ACH payloads, was successfully downloaded by the State Civil Fraud Investigation Division. The associate lawyer leaned closer to his screen, his face draining of color. Mr. Harrison, the young associate whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he turned the laptop toward the senior partner. The audit payload is unredacted. The merchant codes are fully verified. Juliana stood up so fast, her heavy leather armchair rolled backward, its steel casters grinding loudly against the hardwood floor. This is a breach of contract, she snapped, her corporate alpha composure fracturing into sharp, jagged edges. She's sabotaging a legal restructuring. Julian, say something. Tell them she's unstable. Julian didn't speak. He was staring at the tablet screen resting in front of the associate lawyer. I didn't give her room to breathe. I tapped the tablet again, pushing the second unredacted file to the shared drive display. File 2 is DocuSign IP verification record 88492, I said, my flat monotone cutting through the tension like a mechanical blade. A $150,000 commercial promissory note issued by Apex Mezzanine Capital at 18.5% interest. The sole personal guarantor listed on page 12 is Julian Vance. My brother's head snapped up. His eyes went wide, his breath catching in his chest with a wet, ragged gasp. What? He stammered, his hands flying to the edge of the mahogany table. What promissory note? I never signed a commercial guarantee. The digital signature was executed at 11:42 p.m. on Sunday, May 14th, I said, looking straight at the wall behind him. From IP address 172.56, the static Wi-Fi router registered to Juliana's personal residence. While you were asleep under prescribed medication, Julian, your wife forged your name to a personal guarantee that tied your home, your personal equity, and your entire personal financial existence to an extortionate commercial loan. She used that loan cash to fund the fake software invoices, laundering the money through her father's feed store to cover her private country club deposits. Julian turned his head slowly, looking at his wife like he was seeing a complete stranger standing beside him. The martyr's indoctrination that had kept him paralyzed for 3 years didn't just break. It shattered into dust right there in front of corporate counsel. You put the house on a mezzanine loan? Julian's voice wasn't corporate anymore. It was raw, shaking, and choked with pure suffocating disbelief. You forged my name while I was asleep? Julian, darling, listen to me, Juliana began, reaching out to touch his shoulder, her voice pitching up into a desperate, hurried flutter. It was an operational bridge. It was a capital efficiency strategy to secure our exit multiple— Don't touch me! Julian roared, slamming both palms down onto the mahogany table so hard the glass water pitcher rattled against the silver tray, ice sloshing over the rim. Get your hands off me! Mr. Harrison, revoke her signature authority right now. I want an immediate legal separation. I want her out of this building. Tyler, the junior executive sitting beside her, didn't say a word. His face was ash gray. He quietly closed his leather notebook, slipped his pen into his pocket, stood up from his chair without making a sound, and practically sprinted out the side door of the conference room to sever himself from the falling wreckage. Juliana stood frozen in the middle of the room, her designer blazer suddenly looking stiff and absurd, her hands trembling so violently that her gold-trimmed pin slipped from her fingers and clattered loudly across the hardwood floor. I reached into my worn blazer pocket. I pulled out the cheap, crumpled $10 Starbucks e-gift card she had left on my desk 2 days ago. The insult she had handed me while stealing my father's business. I leaned forward, setting the plastic card down directly over the highlighted yellow arrow on the equity surrender document. "You can keep the $10, I said, my voice dropping into an absolute, freezing whisper that carried through the dead silence of the room. "To help cover your administrative filing fees." I picked up my tablet, stood up from my chair, and looked Juliana dead in the eye for the very first time all afternoon. "The audit log is already synced to the civil portal, so you can stop explaining the macroeconomics because I am revoking your security badge." Juliana didn't scream. She didn't drop to her knees or burst into dramatic tears like a character in a television movie. Instead, her mouth twisted into a strange, uncanny smile, a high, fluttering laugh bursting from her throat as she took a quick, shallow breath, her manicured hands moving compulsively to smooth the front of her $3,000 designer skirt. But the fabric wouldn't lay flat because her fingers were rattling so violently they looked like dry leaves in a draft. "Mr. Harrison, please, this is obviously just a software API routing error." She giggled, her voice light, airy, and completely disconnected from the cold reality of the room. She looked at the senior corporate lawyer, her eyes wide, glassy, and completely unblinking. "The third-party clearinghouse portal simply misclassified the agricultural routing numbers during the data migration last quarter. It's a technical bug, a clerical glitch in the system. We can easily pivot the narrative before any formal press release goes out. We can reframe this line item as a rural infrastructure development initiative." I stood at the far end of the mahogany table, holding my tablet flat against my ribs. "The state civil auditor doesn't debug APIs, Juliana," I said, my voice maintaining that cold, flat, unbroken monotone, completely devoid of anger or triumph. "The equity transfer is legally voided, and your shell company's accounts are under a civil freeze." Her face went completely rigid. The delusional smile stayed glued to her lips, but her eyes flickered with a dark, desperate panic. She lunged across the polished wood, her hands snatching her sleek smartphone off the silver tray, her acrylic nails snapping against the glass casing with a loud, sharp crack. She swiped her thumb across the screen, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps as she tried to log into the master corporate HR portal. She was trying to execute an emergency administrative termination, trying to revoke my security credentials, wipe my cloud clearance, and lock me out of the building before the corporate lawyers could finish reviewing the files. "I am revoking your administrative access. I am terminating your employment contract for gross insubordination," she gasped, her thumbs hammering against the glass with frantic, clumsy force. The screen refreshed. The enterprise portal didn't crash or display a flashing red warning. It loaded cleanly, displaying a dull, gray system banner across the top header of her phone. "Access denied. Administrative privileges suspended, pending civil fraud review." She stared at those 6 gray words. Her grip failed completely. The smartphone slipped from her weak fingers, clattering against the edge of the mahogany table before bouncing onto the carpet with a dull thud. Civil justice in the real world doesn't happen with flashing sirens, dramatic arrests, or SWAT teams crashing through glass doors. It moves with the agonizing, heavy grind of a rusty conveyor belt. 6 weeks later, the final civil liquidation order came down. No cinematic raid, just a bored postal worker in a blue uniform walking into the terminal lobby at 8:15 on a rainy Tuesday morning, handing my brother a thick yellow envelope containing 3 certified court orders. Juliana had tried one final, desperate counterstrike, hiring a cheap strip mall civil attorney to file a frivolous harassment claim against the yard. But her own frantic, sloppy paperwork only handed the state civil court the exact missing tax clearing slips they needed to finalize the asset seizure. Every credit line she had opened using fake corporate collateral was called due simultaneously by the bank fraud departments. Her father's agricultural feed store was hit with a mandatory state audit, shutting down its clearing merchant status overnight and freezing every asset tied to their maiden name. The fallout tore through her ecosystem like an industrial shredder. Julian filed for an emergency annulment 3 weeks after the conference room meeting. But his social standing was completely wiped out. The wealthy country club circles and regional business executives he had tried so hard to court alongside Juliana treated him like a contagious disease. They stopped taking his calls, canceled his invitations, and left him sitting alone in his half-empty, mortgaged house, surrounded by custom leather furniture he couldn't pay for, forced to work a midnight dispatch shift at the yard just to cover the monthly interest on the high-risk loan she had forged in his name. And Tyler, the sleek 26-year-old junior executive who had smirked at my frayed blazer and called me a bean counter, found his name blacklisted across every regional logistics firm. 3 months later, I saw him working the floor at a high-end department store downtown. He was wearing a cheap synthetic uniform vest, holding a lint roller, scrubbing floor scuffs in the shoe department for minimum wage, ducking behind garment racks whenever former business associates walked past his register, hiding his face in absolute shame. Stripped of her fake equity, her luxury loaner car repossessed, and her name flagged across the regional banking network, Juliana was buried under a mountain of civil wage garnishments and court-ordered restitution fees. Her entire life became governed by the very mundane, rigid administrative rules she had spent years looking down on. On a rainy Tuesday morning in November, she was sitting on a cracked fiberglass chair inside the dreary lobby of the State Unemployment and Civil Services office downtown. The air smelled of wet umbrellas, floor wax, and cheap pot coffee. She wore a faded, oversized rain jacket, her manicured nails long gone, her hair pulled back into an untidy knot. On her lap sat a 4-page basic state assistance application form, a simple, low-level data entry document. Without a junior executive or an administrative assistant to handle her paperwork, she was completely illiterate to basic administrative reality. She stared at line 12, asking for a standard merchant tax classification number, her hands trembling, her chest heaving as she experienced a pathetic meltdown right there in front of window 4. I don't understand what these boxes mean, she sobbed softly to the bored clerk behind the thick glass partition, her voice cracking with helpless frustration. Where do I put the executive dividend adjustment? Who is supposed to fill this out for me? The clerk didn't even look up from her monitor. She just reached out, tapped a dry finger against the printed sign taped to the counter, and said, "Next in line." The bank clawback order hit our primary operating account on a quiet Thursday afternoon in December. The State Civil Court's Financial Recovery Division executed a full, mandatory freeze on Juliana's agricultural shell accounts, recovering $38,400 of the stolen software consulting fees directly back into Vance Logistics' payroll reserves. The $150,000 mezzanine loan, the one where she had forged my brother's digital signature, was officially declared void ab initio by the Commercial Lenders Fraud Committee, transferring 100% of the civil liability directly to Juliana's personal bankruptcy estate. My Class A stock standing was legally restored by the board, and by unanimous vote of the drivers and dispatch staff, I was appointed Chief Operating Officer. 2 weeks after the final court decree came down, my brother Julian walked into my back office at 6 o'clock in the evening. The yard outside was dark, the winter rain tapping steadily against the glass window. He didn't wear his tailored wool jacket anymore. He wore a faded blue work coat that was frayed at the cuffs. He sat down in the squeaky vinyl chair across from my desk, holding a cold paper cup of diner coffee, his hands shaking so softly that the brown liquid rippled against the cardboard rim. He sat there in silence for almost 3 full minutes, looking at the floorboards, his shoulders slumped like a man holding up a collapsing ceiling. I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry, Maya, he whispered, his voice hoarse, catching in his throat as he took a shaky breath. Look, you have to understand. I thought I was protecting the family. I thought if I just let her manage the high-level business, if I sacrificed my own authority, she would save the company for all of us. I thought I was being a good provider. I looked at him across the mahogany desk. I didn't feel rage, and I didn't feel a surge of bitter satisfaction when a heavy wooden crate filled with precision iron fittings drops off a forklift and shatters against the concrete floor. You don't yell at the broken metal. You don't pretend the internal gears are still aligned. As an inventory operations auditor, you simply step over the debris, inspect the cracked housing, and acknowledge that the unit has suffered catastrophic structural failure. You record the serial number, log the damage in the master database, and write the item off as non-recoverable operational shrinkage. My brother wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a deeply broken man who had convinced himself that playing the helpless martyr, letting his wife abuse his sister and threaten his own diabetic daughter's health care, was somehow a noble sacrifice. You didn't sacrifice yourself for the family, Julian, I said softly, my voice completely flat, devoid of heat or malice. You sat in that hallway and let her use Lily's insulin as a weapon to keep me quiet. That wasn't martyrdom. It was cowardice. The yard is operating normally now, and Lily's insurance is permanently locked under Class A equity protection, but you no longer have administrative access to my life. Julian closed his eyes, his chin trembling, but he didn't argue. He knew the ledger was closed. He stood up, set his paper cup on the corner of the filing cabinet, and walked out of the back office, his boots clicking heavily down the empty hallway. I turned around to my primary computer terminal. I opened the Master Enterprise Domain Controller, the central server network that governed every digital clearance key, email account, and administrative credential in the company. I navigated to the Active Directory User Management Console. I highlighted the administrative profile string, julian.vance@vancelogistics.com. My fingers didn't hesitate against the mechanical keyboard. I opened the Security Permissions tab, clicked the Global Administrative Override drop-down, and unassigned his master access tokens. I clicked the red action prompt at the bottom of the window. Revoke Alpha Credential. I dragged my mouse across the Windows GEU. He laughed. Now you're gonna have to. A simple gray dialog box appeared on the screen. User account successfully decommissioned. System permissions purged. I closed the server window. I didn't block his cell phone, and I didn't write a long, emotional letter. I simply removed his administrative signature from the digital infrastructure of my father's business, severing his access forever. By 7 o'clock, the entire building was completely quiet. The drivers had finished their evening routes, the semi-trucks were parked in neat, dark rows out in the gravel yard, and the rain had settled into a gentle, misting rain. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small cardboard box that had arrived by courier that morning. I opened it, pulled out a fresh, new box of monthly contact lenses, and inserted a clean lens into my left eye. The white-hot, dry friction that had tormented my cornea for months vanished instantly. My vision cleared, sharp, crisp, and perfectly focused. I sat alone at my desk in the soft, warm glow of a single desk lamp. The blue LED monitor light hummed quietly, displaying our master inventory control dashboard. The top banner was glowing with a clean, steady green indicator. System integrity, 100% reconciled. I reached down into the bottom drawer of my metal cabinet and lifted out my father's old inventory binder. The worn, leather-bound ledger with the yellowed pages and purple ink. I set it gently on top of the clean desk blotter and opened it to the very last page. I picked up my dad's heavy wooden rubber stamp, pressed the rubber face firmly into the purple ink pad resting beside my keyboard, and aligned the stamp with the bottom margin of the final entry. I pressed down hard, feeling the solid wood resist against my palm. Reconciled. The bold, purple ink dried cleanly against the paper. I ran my fingers over the raised lettering, feeling the faint, familiar texture of the worn calfskin cover under my thumb. The noise was gone. The fake corporate talk, the threat to my niece, the gaslighting and the suffocating fear, all of it had been audited out of existence. I closed the binder, set it carefully on the shelf behind my desk, and sat back in my chair, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of the rain falling on the steel roof of Dock 3. I was safe. The company was safe, and for the first time in 10 long years, the ledger was finally balanced. I didn't attempt to reopen their closed accounts, and I never audited their personal deficits again. The fraudulent inputs are permanently restricted. The parasitic drain is blocked from the main server, and my personal baseline is finally operating on clean math. The liability is severed, and the books are closed.